My name's Fran Milburn. I was born in the Western Suburb Hospital in Waratah back in 1947. I've since moved to the Gold Coast, but up until I was my early 20s, I lived in Georgetown itself, in Moat Street, which is just down the road from the Western Suburbs. My mother was a seamstress all her life. From when she was about 16 years old, she was given her mother's sewing machine and she started sewing then. And she went, from when she was 16 to when she was 21, she worked at an orphanage in Young, New South Wales, and used to make hats and shorts and stuff for the kids in the orphanage. She said she could, from start to finish, she could make a pair of boys' shorts out of the curtains, a bit like Sound of Music. She could make a pair of boys' shorts out of the curtains in 10 minutes. When she came out of the from the orphanage, she worked there for 5 years. She went to work with her cousin in Tumbarumba, where my mother had come from. Worked with her cousin who had a little dressmaking business there, and they worked there for 2 or 3 years together, both living on the premises itself in front of a bakery. And it was from there that my mother eventually met my father in Wagga. He was an Englishman, about 12 years older than her, but she always said that if anyone wanted to marry her, they'd have to ask her 3 times before she'd agree. So he nearly got turned off after the second time, but he did ask her a third time. And so she married him, and then from then on, when they were married and living in Wagga from that point until 1942, strangely enough, he was working at the lamp works, which had moved from Newcastle because of the threat of the Japanese attacking Newcastle, which they did from the submarine. Around about the time the attack happened, they were advertising in Wagga for staff, and my father turned up. He had been the manager of the Wagga Riverina Cool stores, and he applied for a job, and he worked for electric lamp manufacturers in Australia. They had a factory because they were scared if the factory had been wiped out in Newcastle, in Hamilton. They were there since the 1930s. If it had been wiped out, there was no way Australia anywhere could get electric lamps, because that was the only, you couldn't get any from overseas because, the Germans and Japanese were in charge of, bombing ships and everything. So they divested their business and took some of it to Wagga, inland, away from the coast. And the day that they were actually starting in Wagga was basically the day that Newcastle was bombed. So it was it's almost like they had an inkling that something was going to happen. They never ever did much damage, the Japanese in Newcastle. But a couple of years later they moved back, and they said to my father, if you want to come back, if we haven't got a job for you, we'll find a job for you. Anyway, he finished up being, until he retired, the purchasing officer at the lamp works. So that's how come we finished up. And I was born here, but my 2 brothers were born in Wagga before they moved. And that's how we finished up in Newcastle. And my mother earned more than my father as a seamstress. She would work through the night. You put your kids to bed and they wouldn't shut up, and she'd go mad at us. But if in the middle of the night, 1 o'clock or something, you wake up, you go out, she'd be and then she'd realise that obviously you're just not going. It's not because you're not going to sleep. There's something wrong with it. She was such a loving person, well, to me, and more so to me, I think. My 2 brothers always thought I was spoiled because I was the youngest. I was supposed to be a girl. I was supposed to be Margaret, actually. My mother had a child in 1939 that was stillborn, and it was a little girl. And then she had my brother John, who eventually was offered a basketball scholarship. He lives in America, so he went to America on a basketball scholarship back in 1961. And they had Graham. So John and Graham were born in Wagga, and then they moved to Newcastle. And then my mother said she wanted to have another child, and my father said, "No, you've got too many already." And she said, "I just want to replace my little girl." And he said, "Well, righto, well, this is it." So I was supposed to be Margaret.
And your brother, whose home we're recording this in, because you were visiting over Christmas and New Year, which is lovely, is a musician and has played in bands all his life.
Oh yeah, he was in the Magnetics. He was in Page One. He was in Nevada, who had a residency at the Waratah Mayfield RSL at one stage for quite a few years. But then he went over to Nevada. That's where the name came from, the Nevada. But he's probably for 50 years of his life, he always had, apart from his normal day job, which was like in electrical sort of work, he always was in a band. We used to go and watch him and when I was not even old enough to be in the pub, but I used to sneak in and listen to him.
But your mum, Fran Milburn, as a seamstress, one of the very generous things that you shared with Lost Newcastle was a whole lot of photographs of the wedding dresses and the brides that she looked after for many, many years. That's in itself a really extraordinary collection to have.
Can I explain how the collection came about? My mother used to charge £40 to do a wedding right from the start, and that included whatever the person wanted. It could be 3 bridesmaids, the mother of the bride, the going away dress, everything was all included. And she insisted on the day of the wedding of being at the church to make sure the dress was just right as she walked off down the aisle. And some people would say to her, oh, we appreciate it so much, she wouldn't charge any more. And she said, I'd just like a photo. But she didn't start doing that straight away. It took, in maybe the mid-50s before she but she got some before that. And in the end, she said, I'll come and do it, I love it, but all I'd like is one of your photos, if you could give me one of the photos. But she never ever wrote on the back of them. So we had a box, and my mother estimated she did over 200 weddings in her time, and that included, she not included, but she also did frocks and stuff like that. But so she had this box of photos, and then before she passed on, she gave me all her photos from through her life. But I didn't know who any of them were. Well, maybe a handful of them I knew who they were. But it wasn't until I put them on the Lost Newcastle site that suddenly people were coming out of the woodwork, left, right and centre, say, oh, that's so-and-so. Now, if someone tells me the name of the person, then I'm a genealogist. I know what sites to go and look at, whether it be birth, deaths and marriages, newspapers and stuff, just know. So once you tell me the name of the bride, and especially if you tell me what a married name is too, then I can, because sometimes if you had a Mary Smith, there might be, too many Mary Smiths or something or other, but... So not having, initially we put over 80 photos, I think, on, and suddenly within no time we had about 50 of them identified who they were. And then, like I say, then I could sort of say, right, well, this is the date that it happened and this is who she married. And sometimes I had a little bit of a history of what happened to the person, yeah.
That makes me so happy that little Facebook group that I started nearly 12 years ago, this is actually the fruit of that. And it is so incredibly valuable, whether they're personal family stories, like this is your story, your Milburn family story, but you are now contributing to the stories of at least another 50 families.
Oh, yeah. My main worry is, as most people who do genealogy concerned, what am I going to do with my work when I'm finished? My kids aren't interested in it. Well, they might be later on, and that tends to be what happens. It's not until they're later in life that they take an interest. But I look at all these photos and think, I can imagine that someone's saying, who are these people? And they just throw it out. So I just like the fact that we've got the opportunity here of being able to record it, and scan the photos and sort of put them somewhere for posterity.
Frank, what you've said there is precisely the reason that I started the group. It is because that shoebox full of photos in the top of your grandmother's wardrobe that when she dies and they've got no context or meaning, they often end up at the tip.
Yeah. It provokes the conversation, doesn't it? It brings it out of people. I mean, I've been on the Gold Coast since 1972, but I'm a Novocastrian at heart, and I hate it when people call it Newy. Sorry. I'm a Novocastrian at heart because I was brought up here and so I look at it all the time, and things that people post on that site, I think, oh yes, I can remember that happening.
I learn a lot from people sharing their stories and photos. And Frank, I wanted to ask you about you said the very first wedding dress that your mum made was her own. Tell me about that.
She was working with her cousin at this little dressmaking shop in Tumbarumba, and she said we catered to everybody. Everyone used to come to us, sort of all the locals. We lived in the front room of a bakery, and we used to go to the pub to have a shower, and we used to get a counter lunch from the local cafe at lunchtime, and we cut it in half because we were looking after our figure. And she met the man she eventually married, and her mother gave her the material to make her wedding dress. It was magnolia satin. And she and her cousin made this, and they had a unique way. They never used to use patterns. They used to fit the figure. So it's not like they'd sort of lay it down and say, well, here's a pattern that we've got, we'll cut the pieces out. They'd get a bit of newspaper and they'd put it on the person and say, right, that's where it goes, and then they might use that as a basis on what to cut up. They used to buy material and stuff from a place in Wagga, and once they asked her, they knew she was going to get married soon, and they said, would you come to a fashion parade and model the wedding dress? And she said, oh, you've never, because she was quite shy, She said, "You never seen such a bashful bride in your life as me at this thing." She said, "But I did like the veil that they had me wear, and I copied the dress. Where I had an idea. I liked the dress, so we copied it, from my memory of what it was like, and so basically that's what it was. But that dress that she made, back then, leading into the war, everything was sort of scarce. So when her two sisters later married, they both had the dress and they had it altered slightly, and then another family friend, she had it. So they were right into recycling back at that point, sort of in the late 30s to the 1940s.
It's a beautiful dress.
I don't know. I said to her, "Whatever happened in the end?" She said, "Oh, I can't ever remember." I would have thought she might have kept it, but anyway, there's photos of it there.
And the two sisters and Grace, their friend, all wear the same dress. Do you have other favourites in this collection?
Well, my mother's favourite collection is the full length one of my cousin, and her name was Sue Dickinson. And that's my mother's favourite. She said that's her favourite dress of all the ones that she ever made. She thought that was the best job she ever did, and that's why it's a big photo of her there.
Yeah, it's stunning. It's quite beautiful. It's quite a collection, isn't it? This is 20 years of your mother's work.
The thing is, my mother said in her life, she estimated she did over 200 weddings. There's only maybe 90 photos here, so she hasn't got photos of all of them by any means.
Wouldn't it be good if some more photos were offered back to you from lost Newcastle members who maybe have a memory of who made them?
Well, I've had people say, "Oh, I remember Mrs. Milburn. She made my dress," and I nearly felt like saying, "Oh, would you mind sending me a photo?" I think there is one in the back where the lady did send me. Yeah, so she said, "Oh yeah, your mother made my," so she sent me the photo, so that's why it's added in there. I never had the original.
And you've also got some Deb frocks at the back for the debutante balls. Same, only different. How special. Frank, thank you. I just think this is the most beautiful collection, and that you're sharing it with people and adding to their own family stories is an incredibly generous thing, and I hope that the Losties are able to come back to you with a lot more information.
On some of the ones that aren't identified, it'd be good.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
Thank you.